Welcome. I'm Liz Whitehead, Managing Editor Events at U.S. News and World Report. I'm joined by Shannon Watts, who founded the Grassroots group Moms Demand Action to fight gun violence after the Sandy Hook school mass shooting tragedy in 2012. Under Ms. Watts' leadership, Moms Demand Action has been instrumental in securing gun safety laws in state houses around the country and helped secure passage of the first federal gun legislation in a generation. She's an active board member of Emerge America, one of the nation's leading organizations for recruiting and training women to run for office, and is the author of Fight Like a Mother, How Grassroots Movement Took on the Gun Lobby and Why Women Will Change the World. Ms. Watts, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So heading into the final week before the 2024 election, the continuing epidemic of school shootings is one reason that gun safety and violent crime rank among the top issues driving young voters and women particularly, who are impatient with the slow pace of change, particularly as the costs of inaction are extraordinary. First, can you just very basically sketch out how you see the trajectory of school shootings across the country in recent years? Is the situation worsening?
Yeah, it's not your imagination. If you are a parent and you are scared about sending your kids to school, there's a reason for that. If you're my age and I was born in 1971, since then, school shootings have quadrupled in this country. There were about 20 school shootings in 1970. In 2021, there were over 250. And this is a uniquely American crisis. There is no other high-income country where they tolerate the ongoing shootings on school grounds of students, of teachers. And we know the reason for this. About 2/3 of all school shooters are under the age of 17, and almost all of them access handguns, which is the most common weapon used in school shootings, in their homes, right? So their parents or their guardians have unsecured guns in their homes, they get them and they bring them to school. And yet we are also one of the only high-income countries that when there's shooting tragedies, our reaction is not to act, but to ignore it. And so it is not shocking that we have this crisis in our country. And we know the solution, right? And I think that's what makes it so frustrating. But at the end of the day, these school shootings, or even the threat of them, cause such incredible fear and anxiety and worry among parents and students alike.
Yes, and we focus on every time there is a new tragedy, Sandy Hook and Uvalde and other schools, Columbine years ago, we focus on the casualties of the moment. But you just touched on something else, which is perhaps the understatement of the trauma of the constant specter of threats over these schools, students, administrators, teachers, and the police. And I'd like to break that up into two parts for a second. When there is an active threat, teachers, administrators, and police must investigate every one. And then they have to calm down an agitated student body, maybe exposed to them. And they have to do this all without disrupting school operations. Can you talk about, as you've gone around the country, how teachers and administrators have talked to you about trying to manage this problem?
Yeah, let's put it in context first. You mentioned Columbine, right, which happened in 1999, that horrific mass shooting at that high school. Since then, over 338,000 students in America have experienced gun violence at school. And in 2022, there were about 46 mass school shootings, more than any since Columbine. And this is obviously a crisis, not just with school shootings, but with gun violence in general. In fact, gun violence is now the leading cause of death among American children and teens. About 1 out of every 10 gun deaths are people who are under 19, and firearm deaths now occur at a rate more than 5 times higher than drownings. So this is, we live in a country where the threat of gun violence always looms. And you were talking about the toll that it takes, whether it's real actualized trauma or vicarious trauma, right? That they all impact our students in their ability to learn, our teachers in their ability to teach, our parents in their ability to not worry that their children are going to come home from school. And that does take a toll. I'm not sure we know what that toll is yet, but we know that even the threat of gun violence causes a toll. So, for example, There are so many drills now in our schools, again, because gun violence is the leading cause of death among children. And we know that those drills cause extreme anxiety, sleeplessness, depression, worsening performance in school, all kinds of comorbidities, right, that go along with anxiety and trauma, and that impacts teachers as well. So when we talk about these threats that are coming in, and I think what's interesting is a lot of these threats have been found to be made from people in other countries, people who want to terrorize America. This seems like an easy way to do it because we are at risk. That the threat of violence and the violence itself causes so many corresponding consequences. And I think that we'll be unpacking this honestly for decades.
Yeah, and this seems to be top of consciousness for, as you said, for almost every parent, teacher, and administrator. Last week at a town hall in Michigan, Vice President Kamala Harris told of her conversation with a young student who confided their fear in going to a fifth period class. And she said, "Why, sweetheart?" And the kid said, "The class didn't have a closet to
Mm.
hide in." So when you
Oh,
think about the immediacy of the fear that a kid is going to a class first, not to learn, but their first thought is, where am I going to be safe if somebody comes to shoot me?
yep.
Well, how do you feel? You're a mother of five. How do you feel bringing up your kids in this evolving environment?
It makes me so angry because look, this is not a polarizing issue among Americans. About it depends on whether there's been a shooting in the news lately, but it's typically between 70 to 90% of all Americans, regardless of political party, support common sense solutions to gun violence. For example, we know that 4.6 million children in America live in homes with unsecured guns. That means there's at least one gun that is loaded and unlocked. And as I said before, the vast majority of school shootings are by students who access guns in their homes. So even by passing these laws that require adults to securely store their firearms, we would go a long way in preventing these shootings. But there are, when I say it's not polarized among Americans, it is polarized among some American lawmakers, where you have very conservative right-wing extremists who believe that any law whatsoever is somehow an assault on the Second Amendment. And so that is what makes me so enraged. That's my reaction, because this gun violence is senseless and it's preventable, and the data shows us how to fix it. And yet we have lawmakers who are standing in the way of that. And it's so outrageous and honestly craven. You were just talking about kids are scared to go to the bathroom because they'll be locked out during not just gun violence, but even just a drill. Kids are scared to wear sneakers that light up, little kindergartners, those sneakers that have lights on them. Kids are afraid to go to school in general, especially when these threats that you were talking about happen. And I find it so outrageous that we've gotten to a place where we have to act as though this is normal and figure out how to work around it as opposed to stopping it completely.
Yeah, let's delve in a little bit more deeply to this uh, disconnect between the vast majority of Americans who seem to agree on what common sense gun measures they would support, and then these lawmakers. And then let's be honest about lobbyists, and there's gun manufacturer money that also influences some of these lawmakers. However, after the horrific Robb Elementary School shooting in Uvalde in 2022, the Biden-Harris administration did get bipartisan support. Groups like yours got behind it for the pass the Safer Communities Act that had a number of measures, including more funding for school violence prevention and intervention programs, sort of touching on what you were saying. Does it always take some terrifically tragic incident to move action, or is there a way to sort of learn how to frame these issues more to put pressure on these lawmakers to make changes?
Well, I want to be clear that we are absolutely making huge change. I mean, there's been a seismic shift on this issue in American politics since I started working with Moms Demand Action in 2012. So after the Sandy Hook school shooting tragedy, just in the days after, if you looked at Congress, about 25% of all Democrats had an A rating from the NRA in Congress. Today, not a single one does. And that's because we created this grassroots army that showed them that we would hold them accountable if they did not do the right thing. And we would have their backs when they did do the right thing. And that made all the difference on this issue, right? As it does with any issue in this country. You need a grassroots army that will support you when you vote your conscience. And if you remember in the days after the Sandy Hook school shooting tragedy, in the months after, there was a bipartisan bill put forward called the Manchin-Toomey bill, Senators Manchin and Toomey, a Democrat and Republican, that would have closed the background check loophole in this country. You can buy a gun with no background check if you buy from an unlicensed seller. And they were going to close that loophole because of that tragedy. That bill, I was sitting in the Senate gallery when it failed by just a handful of votes, including some Democratic senators who voted against it. And, almost a decade later, actually exactly a decade later, when the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act came up because of the shootings in Uvalde and in Buffalo, that bill passed. And the reason it passed was because we created this grassroots army and we got 15 Republicans to vote for it because they were hearing more from their constituents in favor of it than against it, right? That's a complete huge shift in American politics that took a decade. And in the intervening years, we passed over 500 good gun bills in state legislatures. We stopped the NRA's agenda 90% of the time, year after year. So real progress has been made. I don't think it's about the framing of the issue, honestly. When so many Americans support it, I think it is about getting these intransigent lawmakers out of the way. And I will tell you that the reason the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act passed after Buffalo and Uvalde was not because so many Republicans had a change of heart and mind. It's because Mitch McConnell saw polling, and that polling showed that they were going to lose seats in the midterm elections if they voted against this bill, that it was going to become a major voting issue, and it was anyway. But they would have lost more seats had they stood in the way of it. And so that is how you move the needle on these things. You show lawmakers that there are consequences for inaction, and that takes a while.
So, do you feel that more effectively wielding the power of grassroots, is it, the daily visits or the weekly visits to state or lawmakers and pushing these issues, letting them know we're going to mobilize people in your community to vote or not vote for you in the next election? Is it really not just focusing on the federal, but really getting down in your neighborhoods, in your
Yes.
districts to put power and then sort of leveraging that?
It is building a grassroots army that lawmakers either fear or appreciate. And that takes a while. It took us almost a decade, to be able to pass that first in a generation federal legislation. But in the meantime, we were making huge inroads in state legislatures. I mean, we were able to, for example, Virginia, when I started Moms Demand Action in 2012, Virginia was a completely red state, and any kind of gun law bill was a non-starter. We just continued to have meetings and go to rallies and attend hearings and create relationships with lawmakers. And then when there was a mass shooting tragedy in Virginia Beach in 2019, we showed up in mass at the State House. Republicans held a special session. They gavelled out in seconds and refused to do anything on this issue. We were able to galvanize so quickly and create such an impact in the days after that mass shooting tragedy that we were able to flip both chambers of the General Assembly and the governorship, elect Democrats down the line. And we had built this foundation, and in the following years, we passed over a dozen good gun bills in that state. Now, the state has swung back and it has a Republican governor, but none of those protections have been undone. And I can tell you so many other states where we've done that: Massachusetts, Minnesota, Colorado, on and on. And it really is about playing the long game. I think sometimes incrementalism is considered a dirty word in activism because it does take a while, but that's how the system is set up. And it is that incrementalism that I have seen lead to revolutions.
So as voters start working on making their final decision between now and November 5th on whom to entrust in these issues, what would you like them to think about?
Well, I would say go to gunsensevoter.org and see where your lawmakers stand on this issue. Something that we started doing is creating these surveys that we ask Democrats and Republicans and independents alike to fill out. Where do you stand on background checks? Where do you stand on an assault weapons ban? Where do you stand on red flag laws? Do you think we should disarm domestic abusers? And then the answers to those questions determine whether we give them what we call a gun sense distinction. And that has become a badge of honor. And if you don't have that, it's something that I think suburban women and mothers in particular look at with skepticism. Why don't you support gun safety? And if you look at polling, I mean, I think it's pretty interesting that Republican and Democratic women alike support the same solutions to gun safety. So that gun sense distinction is really important. Many women, I know we don't lead single issue lives, but we are single issue voters on this issue, because if our children aren't safe in their schools, in their streets, in their communities, then what else matters, right? And so I do think that has become something that people look at now in elections. I mean, when I started Moms Demand Action, gun safety did not even really appear in the top 10 of voting issues, and now it is regularly in the top 5.
So just to wrap things up, as we look ahead, you sounded a note of optimism that grassroots organizations that are fighting on these issues are feeling their power and how to wield it effectively. So can you talk about just a little bit how important it is to bring up the next generation of leaders and help them to sort of carry on this work effectively? What needs to be done to find these leaders and train them?
Well, the difference is, even though as a parent, I'm very concerned about school shootings, I didn't grow up hiding in the bathroom of my classroom, rehearsing my death as if that wooden door was going to protect me from the spray of an AR-15. My kids all grew up that way, and my daughter, who's a daycare teacher, has to wheel her babies out in a crib as if, again, that's going to protect them from gun violence. So I think this next generation is even angrier than I am as a mom, because they have been subjected to these drills and these dangers, and this inaction. And I think they're very resentful about it, and they want to change it. And this is why we see so many questions on the campaign trail about it to Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. And thankfully, they are gun safety champions. But I don't know that we have to train or excite the next generation around this issue. They are really taking the baton. I mean, if you consider activism a relay race, they're taking the baton and they're running with it. And I think they will be much less tolerant of lawmakers who are on the side of gun manufacturers than the side of gun safety.
Shannon Watts, thank you for sharing your time and perspective on these critical issues affecting our children. Thank you.
Thank you.